You were born into a world already built. You follow a schedule you never created. You carry money that has no real value. You cross borders that did not exist 1,000 years ago. You go to school in rooms that look like factories. You work at times decided by someone else. You are watched by cameras you never agreed to. You obey laws written by people you never met. You believe this is normal. You believe this is freedom. But none of this happened by accident. Someone designed it. Someone planned it. Someone decided that this is how you should live. When did it begin? How did it spread? Why did no one stop it? Here on Echoed Reality, you will see the hidden moments. You will learn the forgotten facts. You will discover the truth about the systems that control your life. Everything you thought you knew is about to change. In the beginning, there were no systems. There were no rules written down. There were no clocks, no borders, no schools, no money as we know it today. There were only people trying to survive. Small groups of humans lived together in the wild. They hunted animals, they gathered plants, they moved when food ran out, they stayed when water was near. Everyone knew everyone. If someone took too much, the group would know. If someone refused to share, the group would remember. Control was simple. It was face-to-face. It was immediate. But as time passed, these small groups grew larger. Families became clans, clans became tribes, and tribes began to settle in one place. This happened around 10,000 years ago, when humans learned to grow food instead of searching for it. They planted seeds, they waited, they harvested, and for the first time, they stayed. Staying in one place changed everything. It meant people could store food. It meant some people had more than others. It meant new problems appeared. Problems that had never existed before. Who owns this land? Who decides when to plant? Who protects the harvest? The old way of control, the way of small groups who knew each other, no longer worked. So the first systems began to appear, not by accident, not by force alone, but because people needed answers to new questions. In ancient Mesopotamia, around 5,000 years ago, the first cities rose along the rivers. Thousands of people lived together, far more than any tribe had ever held. They built walls, they dug canals, they stored grain in large buildings. But with so many people, memory was not enough. No one could remember who gave what, who owed what, who owned what. So they created something new. They made marks on clay tablets, simple lines and shapes. These were the first written records, not stories, not prayers, but lists. Lists of grain, lists of animals, lists of people. Writing was not born from art. It was born from the need to control resources. And with writing came something else, a group of people whose job was to read and write. Scribes. They were not farmers, they were not builders, they only kept records, and because they kept records, they had power. They knew who had paid, they knew who had not. Information became control. At the same time, leaders emerged who claimed they were chosen by the gods, kings and priests. They said the gods wanted order, they said the gods wanted rules, and the people, who feared chaos, who feared hunger, who feared war, listened. The first laws were written down. The Code of Hammurabi, created around 1750 BC in Babylon, listed nearly 300 rules. Rules about trade, rules about marriage, rules about punishment. Everyone could see the rules, carved in stone. This was new. Before, a king could change his mind. Now, the system was larger than one person. These early systems spread. In Egypt, the pharaohs controlled the Nile. They decided when farmers could use water. They collected grain as tax. They used that grain to feed workers who built pyramids. Thousands of workers, organized, fed, and directed. It was one of the first large work systems. People showed up, they worked, they were given food. It was not freedom, but it was survival. In China, around 200 BC, the Qin dynasty united many kingdoms under one ruler. The emperor wanted control, but the land was vast, so he created something that would last for centuries, a system of standardized weights and measures, one way to count, one way to write, one currency, one width for roads so all carts could travel anywhere. This was not cruelty, it was efficiency, and efficiency made empires possible. But empires also needed people to obey without question, so they built systems to shape the mind. In ancient China, young men studied for years to pass exams. If they passed, they could work for the government. If they failed, they could not. This was one of the first education systems designed not to teach everything, but to teach what the system needed: loyalty, order, obedience to structure. In ancient Rome, control reached a new level. Rome ruled millions of people across 3 continents. To manage this, they built roads, thousands of miles of roads, all leading back to the capital. They created laws that applied to everyone, citizen or not. They counted people in a census, the first large population record. Every few years, every person had to register: name, age, property. If you were not counted, you did not exist in the eyes of Rome. Rome also controlled time. Before Rome, different cities used different calendars. Festivals happened on different days. Trade was confusing. So Julius Caesar created a new calendar in 45 BC, the Julian calendar. 12 months, 365 days. Everyone in the empire followed the same year. Time itself was now organized by the state. But Rome also showed the limits of control. When the empire grew too large, when too many people lived too far away, the systems broke. Roads were not repaired, soldiers were not paid, the records were not updated, and slowly the empire fell. Not in one moment, but across decades. Control, it seemed, required constant energy. If that energy faded, so did the system. After Rome collapsed in the West around 476 AD, Europe entered what many call the Middle Ages. Central control disappeared. Kings were weak. The land was divided among lords, each ruling their own small territory. People lived in villages. Most never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. There were no passports, no borders as we know them. You belonged to the land, and the land belonged to a lord. This was the feudal system. If you were born a peasant, you stayed a peasant. You worked the Lord's land. You gave him part of your harvest. In return, he protected you, or claimed to. You could not leave. You could not choose another life. Your role was decided at birth. It was a different kind of control, not through records or laws, but through tradition and force. The church also grew powerful during this time. It controlled knowledge. Monks copied books by hand. Most people could not read. The Bible was in Latin, a language peasants did not speak. Priests told people what God wanted, and because people feared hell, they obeyed. The church collected taxes, called tithes. It decided who could marry. It recorded births and deaths. In many ways, the church became the record keeper, the system that connected villages across Europe. But around the year 1400, something began to change. Trade increased, cities grew, merchants traveled between regions, buying and selling goods. They needed a way to move money safely. Carrying gold was dangerous, so they invented promissory notes, early versions of checks, a piece of paper that promised payment in another city. This was the beginning of banking. Money was no longer just a coin in your hand. It became an idea, a record, a promise. And then, in 1440, Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press in Europe. For the first time, books could be made quickly. Information could spread. The Bible was printed in languages people spoke. Ideas that the church had controlled for centuries were now available to anyone who could read. This terrified those in power, because control of information is control of people. And now that control was slipping. The printing press helped spark the Protestant Reformation in 1517, when Martin Luther challenged the church. It also helped spread new ideas about government, science, and the individual. Slowly, the idea emerged that people could think for themselves, that they did not need a lord or a priest to tell them what was true. This was dangerous to the old systems, and so those systems fought back. But the world was changing too fast. In the 1500s and 1600s, European ships sailed across oceans. They found new lands. They claimed them. They drew lines on maps and called them borders. People who had lived on that land for thousands of years were told they now belonged to a distant king. Borders were not natural. They were invented, and they were enforced with violence. The age of exploration brought enormous wealth to Europe, but it also brought new problems. How do you control people on the other side of the world? How do you make sure they send wealth back? The answer was systems, colonial governments, written contracts, shipping schedules, records of cargo. The world was being organized, mapped, divided, and controlled from thousands of miles away. At the same time, in Europe, nations were forming. France, England, Spain. These were no longer kingdoms held together by one family. They were states, organized by law, defended by armies, funded by taxes. And taxes required records, detailed records. Who owns land? Who earns money? Who owes what? Governments began to watch their people more closely than ever before. By the 1700s, a new idea was spreading: the Enlightenment. Thinkers like John Locke and Voltaire said that people had natural rights, that governments should serve the people, not the other way around. This led to revolutions: the American Revolution in 1776, the French Revolution in 1789. People fought for freedom, and in some places, they won. But freedom brought its own challenges. If people are free, how do you organize them? How do you run a country where millions of individuals make their own choices? The answer, again, was systems: democratic systems, voting systems, constitutions, written rules that even leaders had to follow. This was a new kind of control, not forced from above, but agreed upon, or so it seemed. The 1800s brought the Industrial Revolution. Machines that could do the work of 100 men, factories that ran day and night. For the first time, work moved from the fields to the cities. Millions of people left their villages and moved to places they had never seen, looking for jobs. In the factories, a new system appeared: the clock. Before industrialization, people worked with the sun. They woke when it rose. They rested when it set. Farmers worked harder during harvest, slower in winter. Time was flexible. But factories needed everyone to arrive at the same moment. So factory owners installed large clocks. They rang bells. Workers had to be on time. If you were late, you were fined. If you missed too many days, you were fired. This was the birth of the modern work schedule: 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours of sleep. It was not natural. It was designed for efficiency, for production, for control. Children worked in these factories too, some as young as 5 or 6. They were small, so they could crawl under machines. They were paid almost nothing. Families needed the money to survive. This continued for decades, until people began to ask, is this right? Slowly, new systems appeared to protect workers: labor laws, minimum wages, limits on working hours, and one more thing: mandatory schooling. In the mid-1800s, governments across Europe and America began to require that all children go to school. This was presented as progress, education for everyone, a chance to rise. But there was another reason. Factories needed workers who could read instructions. Governments needed citizens who could follow rules. Schools taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, but they also taught something else. They taught children to sit still, to raise their hand, to wait for permission, to move when the bell rang, to accept that someone else controlled their time. The school system was based on the factory model. Students were grouped by age, like products on an assembly line. They moved from grade to grade, year by year. Teachers stood at the front. Students sat in rows. There was one right answer, one way to succeed. Creativity was not rewarded. Obedience was. This system spread across the world, not because it was the best way to learn, but because it was the best way to prepare people for a life of work within a system. And most people accepted it, because it promised something new. The idea that anyone, no matter where they were born, could rise if they worked hard enough. It was called meritocracy. The best would succeed, the rest would find their place. But the system also ensured that most would stay in place, because the system decided what best meant. By the late 1800s, nations were becoming more organized. They needed to know who lived within their borders, so they created national identity systems, birth certificates, censuses. In some countries, people were required to carry papers proving who they were. If you could not prove your identity, you could be arrested. This had never existed before. For most of history, you were who you said you were. People knew you by your face, your family, your reputation. But now, in a world of millions, the state needed proof. Your existence had to be recorded. In 1914, the world went to war, World War I. Millions of men were drafted. They were given numbers. They were told where to go, when to fight, when to eat, when to sleep. The military was the ultimate system of control. And when the war ended in 1918, many of those systems stayed. Governments had learned something. In wartime, they could control almost everything: food, fuel, information. They could ration supplies. They could censor newspapers. They could track every citizen. And people accepted it because it was for survival. After the war ended in 1945, two superpowers emerged: the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War began. It was not fought with armies, but with systems. Each side tried to prove that their way of organizing society was better. Capitalism versus communism, freedom versus equality. But both sides used control. In the Soviet Union, the state controlled everything: where you lived, where you worked, what you could say, what you could read. There were secret police, informants. If you questioned the system, you disappeared. In the United States and Western Europe, control was softer but still present. You were free to choose your job, but you needed money to survive. You were free to speak, but corporations controlled the newspapers, the radio, the television. You could vote, but only for candidates approved by political parties. It was a different kind of system, but it was still a system. During the Cold War, both sides invested heavily in technology. Computers were invented, first for war, then for business. In the 1960s, these machines were huge, filling entire rooms. But they could process information faster than any human. They could track inventory, calculate taxes, store records. Governments and corporations began using computers to manage people. By the 1970s, credit cards appeared. You no longer needed cash. You could buy something today and pay later. Banks kept track. Every purchase was recorded. This was sold as convenience, and it was. But it also meant that someone, somewhere, knew what you bought, when, and where. In the 1980s and 90s, computers became smaller. Personal computers appeared in homes. The Internet was born, first as a military project, then as a public network. People could communicate across the world instantly. Information was everywhere. It seemed like freedom. But the Internet also created new systems of control. Websites tracked your clicks. Companies collected data about what you liked, what you searched for, who you talked to. This data was sold. It was used to show you advertisements designed specifically for you. You thought you were exploring freely, but you were being guided. By the year 2000, the world was deeply connected. Money moved instantly across borders. Goods were shipped from one continent to another in days. People traveled more than ever before. But every movement, every transaction, every communication left a trace, digital records that never disappeared. In 2001, after a terrorist attack in the United States, security systems tightened again. Airports installed cameras, metal detectors, body scanners. Governments passed laws allowing them to monitor phone calls, emails, internet activity. This was called the War on Terror. The message was clear. Safety requires surveillance. Freedom requires sacrifice. Most people accepted this because they were afraid, because they were told it was temporary. But temporary systems have a way of becoming permanent. In the 2000s and 2010s, smartphones appeared, small computers that everyone carried in their pockets. They tracked your location. They listened to your voice. They knew your routines. Apps were created for everything: banking, shopping, socializing, and every app collected data. Companies like Google and Facebook became some of the most powerful organizations in the world, not because they made products, but because they controlled information. They knew what billions of people thought, wanted, feared, and they used that knowledge to sell attention, your attention, to advertisers, to politicians, to anyone willing to pay. Algorithms decided what you saw, what news appeared in your feed, what videos played next. These algorithms were designed to keep you watching, clicking, scrolling, not to inform you, not to free you, but to hold your attention, because attention was now the most valuable resource. At the same time, work changed. In many countries, jobs became less secure. People worked multiple part-time jobs instead of one full-time job. The old promise that hard work leads to stability began to fade, but the systems remained. You still needed money, you still needed to work, you still followed the schedule, but now the schedule was everywhere. Phones buzzed with messages from bosses at all hours. Work and life blurred together. Governments also became more sophisticated. In some countries, facial recognition cameras were installed in public spaces. Artificial intelligence analyzed the footage, identifying people in crowds. In China, a social credit system was tested, where citizens were scored based on their behavior. Good behavior earned points. Bad behavior lost points. High scores gave access to better services. Low scores restricted travel, jobs, loans. This was presented as a way to build trust, to reward good citizens. But it was also a system of control more complete than anything in history. Every action watched, every choice recorded, every person measured. In other countries, the systems were less visible, but still present. Algorithms decided who got a loan, who got a job interview, who got arrested. These decisions were made by machines, trained on data from the past. But the past was full of bias, so the machines learned to be biased too. And because the systems were automatic, people trusted them. They seemed fair, neutral, scientific. But they were not. They were designed by people, and people have agendas. Money itself became more abstract. Most money now existed only as numbers on a screen. Central banks controlled how much money was created. They set interest rates, deciding how expensive it was to borrow. If they raised rates, people spent less. If they lowered rates, people borrowed more. The economy, which seemed chaotic, was being steered. Not perfectly, but steered. Cryptocurrencies appeared, promising freedom from banks, from governments, from control. Some people believed this was the future, a system where no one was in charge. But even these new systems developed their own structures. exchanges, regulations, tracking. The dream of total freedom met the reality that all systems eventually require organization. Education continued to follow the same model it had for over a century. Sit in rows, listen to the teacher, take the test, get the grade. Online learning emerged promising flexibility, but it often meant watching videos alone, taking quizzes graded by machines. The system remained, only the method changed. Young people grew up inside these systems. They had never known a world without cameras, without tracking, without screens. To them, this was normal. Privacy was an old idea, something their grandparents talked about. Sharing your life online was expected. If you were not online, you did not exist. Borders remained, even as the world became connected. In fact, in some ways, borders became harder. Walls were built, fences electrified, drones patrolled. People fleeing war, hunger, disaster were stopped at borders, held in camps, sent back. The system decided who belonged where, and the system was not kind. At the same time, the largest corporations became larger than many countries. They employed millions. They controlled supply chains that spanned the globe. They paid taxes in whatever country asked for the least. They answered to no single government. They were their own systems, operating above nations, beyond laws. Work became more automated. Machines replaced cashiers. Robots built cars. Algorithms wrote news articles. People worried about jobs disappearing, but new jobs appeared. Jobs managing the machines, programming the algorithms, maintaining the systems. The nature of work changed, but the need to work did not. Time itself seemed to accelerate. Everything was instant: messages, deliveries, answers. But people felt busier than ever. Calendars filled with meetings, notifications demanded attention. Rest was something you scheduled, not something that happened naturally. The system of time, invented to organize factories, now organized every hour of life. Health became data. Fitness trackers counted steps. Apps monitored sleep. Doctors used algorithms to diagnose disease. Insurance companies used that data to decide who paid more. Your body, your biology, became part of the record, part of the system. Voting, the cornerstone of democracy, became vulnerable, not to fraud in the traditional sense, but to influence. Data companies analyzed voters, dividing them into groups. Micro-targeted ads showed different messages to different people. What you saw depended on who you were, where you lived, what you feared. Elections were still held, people still voted, but what they believed was shaped, quietly, behind the scenes. Pandemics revealed both the power and limits of control. Governments could lock down entire nations, close borders, track infections, mandate behavior, and people, frightened, obeyed. But the systems were fragile. Supply chains broke, hospitals overflowed, misinformation spread faster than truth. Control was strong, but it was not absolute. As the world moved deeper into the 21st century, the systems became invisible. No one thought about them. They were simply how life worked. You went to school because that is what children do. You worked because you needed money. You carried a phone because everyone did. You followed the rules because breaking them had consequences. Most people did not feel controlled. They felt free. They made choices. They bought what they wanted. They said what they thought. And in many ways, they were free, freer than people in the past. But the choices were shaped. The options were limited. The paths were already laid. And the systems continued, growing, adapting, learning, spreading into every corner of life. Built over centuries, layer by layer, each one solving a problem, each one creating new ones, each one promising order, efficiency, safety, progress. No one designed it all at once. No single person controlled it. It emerged from need, from fear, from ambition, from the simple fact that when people gather in large numbers, they need systems to survive. And so the systems remain, quiet, persistent, invisible, organizing billions of lives, guiding, managing, controlling, not with force, but with structure, not with chains, but with schedules, records, borders, money, data, and time. The systems are not evil, they are not good, they simply are, and they continue. The systems are still here, still growing, still watching. But now you see them. Now you know where they came from. And this is only the beginning. There are more stories buried in history, more moments that changed everything, more truths hidden in plain sight. Here on Echoed Reality, we will keep digging. We will show you what they never taught you, what they never wanted you to see. The past is not dead. It is alive, all around you, and there is so much more to discover. Stay with us. The journey has just begun.